It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm just going to pour myself a glass of water quickly. Wonderful to follow such amazing stories, and I have seen some of those videos, The Living Generously. I really encourage you to have a look because they're quite inspirational. So, as Gary said, I'm here from St Elizabeth Hospice, but I've actually been in the charity sector for over 30 years as a fundraiser. And it's just in the last 4 years that I've been a chief executive. But once a fundraiser, always a fundraiser. And actually, it's one of the most rewarding, enriching parts of my role to continue that element of philanthropy that I've always been involved with. And I'm intentionally using the word philanthropy there. And I know many of you have been involved in the world of charity fundraising for a long time. But by the end of this, I hope just to explain what the difference means to me between fundraising and philanthropy. So I really thought about what could I share, what were the reflections that might be helpful in half an hour just to go through. So I thought I would cluster them into some thoughts specifically through the hospice lens. Many of you know the work of St Elizabeth, and here in Bury St Edmunds, our friends at St Nicholas Hospice Care. So extraordinary amount of fundraising that has to happen for our hospices to stay open. So we'll share a little bit about what we have learnt over the last 30, 40 years doing that. And then a little bit more about philanthropy and how we see philanthropy in action. And then I've got a lived example of the speakers today, both Grant and Jonathan, talking about different forms of generosity. And I've got a lived example of that through compassionate communities. So that's what I'll go through today. Grant, I also come from a Salvation Army background, so it's rather nice to see that. And it is very much a part of who we are, I think, as a Salvation heritage of faith in action. So it's really interesting to hear that. So reflection from the hospice. So there are certain preconceptions, I think, about what hospice care delivers, and we'll go through some of that in a moment, but also about our funding. We have some hospice volunteers in the room here today. I've certainly seen Kevin at the back there, who welcomes me to most of our fundraising events. It's lovely to see you here, Kevin. But there are certain images that come to mind when people think of the hospice, one of which is the physical building. That's what people associate often with hospice care. We do have an enormous number of volunteers, 1,700 volunteers, so that's just in East Suffolk. And also the fact that we are very fortunate to have a strong tradition of having generous legacies. And that's the window of eternity that you can see, that new sculpture that's been put in the garden to say thanks to those who have been so generous in their wills. So the sense of the building, the sense of being very volunteer-led, the sense of the legacies, all of that is absolutely true. And we couldn't be where we are without them. But there is so much more as well. Oops, sorry, I think I clipped on. There is so much more. Now, this is a slide. I don't expect you to go through the whole thing, but I actually prepared this for one of our supporters recently to try and explain how much more there was to the hospice than the physical building. So, yes, we have 18 beds in Ipswich, but we also have 6 beds in Beccles Hospital. We also do inreach into the James Paget Hospital. But we also have an outpatients service. We call it community care units. An enormous amount of work goes on in our daycare services, and that includes emotional well-being and bereavement. So it's no much broader than having a referral into our inpatient beds. But then there's also care in our community. 90% of our patients will never see our inpatient unit. They'll never see the inpatient unit. They may have a clinical nurse specialist come to their home. They may access our 24/7 phone line. They may experience the virtual ward in the last 12 weeks of life, but in their own home. There is so much more to a hospice than meets the eye. So the reason I say all of that is that that's part of our messaging that we have to say again and again to try and explain the need for the fundraising that we have to raise each year. We have to raise 12, 13 million pounds every year, and if you think that's just for East Suffolk to deliver the service we have, it's a huge commitment. So you have to explain that. And the way we try and do that is through stories. So I'm just going to share about 3 little stories, all of whom have got the blessing of the families involved to share these stories. And again, that's a generosity of gift to share their story. So that's Lena on the screen there with her husband, Lee. Lena was really brave last year and spoke at our midnight walk and explained why it had been such a revelation to her that when Lee was diagnosed with cancer and was suggested that he had a hospice referral, he absolutely didn't want to hear the word hospice. And he said no to that referral. He absolutely wasn't ready. It's not yet. I don't want to go there yet. I don't want to even talk to them. They had a young family, such a lot for them to already process. When eventually the pain had got bad, he really did need that specialist intervention. It was a revelation to them both about what else could be provided in palliative care, the support to the children, the therapy, the physiotherapy, the occupational therapy. There was so much broader. So Lena is now on a mission to explain to people, please don't reject that early referral. Please, when people talk about hospice, don't think of it just as end of life. And she's been so brave at putting herself on stages in front of hundreds of people to say, please don't make the mistake that we made, because Lee's quality of life and the time he was able to have with his children improved enormously once he'd got that specialist help. So that's Lena's story. Craig, he was a local school teacher. He similarly was really generous and told his story on a video that could be shared, because he'd had such help from the community care unit, not just for himself, but for his daughters as they all came to terms with his diagnosis. Again, it was an enormous gift of his being prepared to tell his story, and we were really grateful to him. Much loved member of the local community in Ipswich, sharing his story. Another woman, Joanna, pictured there with her mum, had enormous benefit from the bereavement service. Now, lots of people don't know the hospices even offer a bereavement service. And in the past, it would only be offered to families if they'd experienced care through the hospice. But during the pandemic, the NHS actually asked, would you open your doors to more bereavement? So actually, we do much, much more bereavement now than people realise. And again, Joanna's been really keen for people to know that, and what enormous help the Living Grief bereavement service had provided to her, and she shared that story. And finally, just on the other side, our young adult service. Lots of people don't know that we have a young adult service. It's called Zest, and it's for young people who leave the hospice children's services, and then they really need something quite bespoke for them, that talks to them as teenagers and as young adults in their 20s about what their needs are and their aspirations and their social needs, desperate for some independence from mum and dad, to have a bit of respite. And that service being able to offer to them is a really special service that's really quite innovative in the country. Now, the reason I've shared all those with you is that they're very, very quick stories. I can guarantee that each one of those will have resonated with a different one of you. So if one of those stories has particularly resonated with the experiences you've had in your family, or what really tugs at your heartstrings, the people sitting either side of you will have had a completely different reaction to those stories, very different stories. And we see this all the time. It's what is actually connecting with you, what is resonating with you. And it may well be it's the empathy for others. It may be that you haven't had any of those life experiences, or your family, but the question of those young adults being able to access equitable hospice care, that might really resonate from a health inequality point of view. It may well be that actually you are resonating with one of those stories, and you're really thankful for care that your family has received. And so it's an in memoriam form of support to say thanks, paying it forward, saying, I would love another family to be able to experience what we experienced. So they're quite different motivations, and obviously it can be all different combinations of those motivations. But it's really important to understand when you're doing your storytelling that what is important to you may well not be what's being received from others. And I think that's been a real lesson in the fundraising world, is that you should never make assumptions about what is motivating somebody. So in your work, for example, I can imagine you may be very, very passionate about your mission work or the heritage of your building or your local youth work. But just because you're really passionate about that, you have to really listen to what's motivating the people that you're talking to, and perhaps encouraging with their generosity. So when it comes to our fundraising, just so you can put this in context, as many of you might know, modern hospices, we get about a third of our funding from the NHS, and the rest needs to be raised from the community in which we serve. So about a third. And I leave that hanging there because that's a much bigger national debate, but that's the world in which we live. Now, we do then try and support, get grants from trusts and foundations, but the vast majority of the other fundraising is from the community. And as you know, we have a lot of retail charity shops that are run by hospices. We have almost 40 with shops and cafes. And remember, that's just in East Suffolk. That's not even in West Suffolk. So a really big retail operation. And that contributes over £1 million a year to the work of St Elizabeth Hospice, so a really meaningful contribution to our work. In our fundraising, we also have wonderful in memoriam events like Suffolk Remembers. Saturday night was the Midnight Walk. Believe it or not, I gave the speech in my pyjamas. Kevin will attest to that. It was quite a surreal experience, and I didn't really expect the East Anglian Daily Times to put a great big picture of me in my pyjamas on a double-page spread, but there you go. But the events fundraising, there's the Great Garden Trail at the moment. We've got Suffolk Dog Day later in the... I mean, it goes on, an extraordinary calendar of events. And I would say to you, please be very cautious about the number of events that you put on, because we're only able to do that because we have 1,700 volunteers. So yes, we have a fundraising team, but as all of you will know, it's an enormous commitment to put on safe and successful events. So we do it, but we do it with open eyes. So when it comes to philanthropy, this is obviously a different form of fundraising, and this is where my background is. All layers of hospice fundraising share the same principles of relationship building and really understanding motivation to give in a rewarding and meaningful way that's reciprocal. It should never be transactional, and it should never be driven by guilt or by duty. This absolutely should be a way in it's a reciprocal, rewarding experience. And with philanthropy, you need to really understand what's happening in that reciprocal conversation that you're having with someone. And that can take a long time. They say it takes about 18 months to 2 years to go from a first cold introduction to somebody to perhaps having a significant gift. My hat goes off to the St Mary Le Tower story, but if that was all entirely cold relationships, I suspect it would take longer than a month. Jonathan's nodding. But we have to ask some questions, and I just put some prompts here about what is wealth. We have assumptions about what wealth is, but as Jonathan knows, actually there's an enormous amount of research at what level people feel able to make a generous gift, and we're not talking about multi-millionaires. So I would encourage you not to make assumptions about where the generosity is going to be found in your community. There's a charity giving report out this week that actually maps the geography of our country and where generosity sits, and it's not always the case that, how can I put this nicely? Don't confuse wealth with generosity, I think is the punchline. But also just to really understand that your community. Now, a timely decision, the reason I put that there is for a really significant gift, in most instances, it's likely to be triggered by a windfall event. It might be that someone sold a business. That might be the opportunity. It may be that there's been an inheritance, that people feel actually my life, I'm happy to share the good fortune of this inheritance. That there might be something has happened in which they'd like to have that conversation. Maybe not, but there may well be. But the most important thing is really understanding their motivation. And the word listen came up. I think, Grant, you said about the importance of listening. Listen. And the reason I say that is I have sat in meetings where I've heard people talk more than they have listened, and they have missed an opportunity because they're so fired up with the passion of their ask that they haven't tried to understand if that's going to connect with the person that they're talking to. So some people, if they've perhaps had that windfall, they've perhaps sold a business, they're perhaps creating a bit of time to think what they would like to do, they might go through the theory of change philosophy, where you really try and understand what's happening to an issue that you care about. And it may be doing a sector scan, understanding what's already happening, really understanding where your input could make a difference. And that needs research. And at the end of that research, there may be a conclusion that yes, it is a gift, that they would like to make, but it might be coupled with time, and it may come coupled with an opportunity to do something different with existing partners. So a theory of change is not just about money, it may be also about a different way to tackle an existing issue that you feel passionate about. So what's our role in that? Well, our role, and we've talked about stewardship earlier today, it's the stewardship of walking alongside someone as they go through that research and that theory of change and how to make a difference, building that relationship and going on a journey together. And this is very much about the connected community in which we live. And this is where we have an enormous advantage in Suffolk. We are blessed with a very connected county. People feel very passionate about Suffolk. And I certainly have seen that again and again and again, where people welcome the opportunity to do that research and to go on that journey together. Now that slide, if that journey went on, it may be that there's one or two people who live in your parish who may want to go on that journey with you and really understand what are the issues that are affecting our parish that may be very different to 2 miles up the road or 10 miles up the road. But there might be an opportunity there. So that's I suppose, the difference between philanthropy and the community fundraising that the hospice is more normally known for. So if we talk about the context of the hospice, what does that look like? And I have to say, we don't have lots of people in this camp, but we do have some people who are really interested in what it means to be invested in understanding the issues that we face. So it may be that they do want to be, the starting point is generosity of money. They may have seen the hospice funding crisis, I'm going to call it, that you're seeing in the sector in other parts of the country, and there may be a wish to really ameliorate the risk to services. I mean, just for an example, I know we've all been affected by the NI changes in the last budget. That was almost £500,000 cost pressure for St Elizabeth Hospice overnight. So that sort of sum, you can't just magic up quickly. So there are thoughtful supporters in our area who are saying, what can we do to help? What can we do in that situation? But then there's creativity, and I have to say we have some extremely thoughtful people who want to support us, but also want to really understand the wider issues. And Edward, I'm going to say that you're in that camp of actually wanting to understand the role of the hospice within our local health sector and advocate and really understand on some of those broader issues. And there's also a movement I'm going to come on to in a moment called Compassionate Communities, which is a public health approach to dying and grief. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So there's generosity of money, there's generosity of creative thinking, and then there's generosity of time. As I say, we've got 1,700 volunteers, and that's an extraordinary amount of support and encouragement for us. That's in the shops, that's at our events, and then that's also actually in the hospice itself with ward clerks, our receptionists. It takes many, many forms. But all of that is a collaboration. It's a sharing of skills, it's a sharing of talents, and absolutely I can feel that there's that theme of actually we all have different talents to bring, and I see that every single day in the hospice. So really special combination of generosity. So the lived example that I wanted to talk about, and I know that's too small to read, but I'm just going to tell you the gist. In palliative and end-of-life care, there's something called the national ambitions. I'm not going to test anyone on this, but just to say that we talked about number 6. And the number 6 national ambition for palliative and end-of-life care is that each community is prepared to help. Now, clearly, we are not all clinicians. We probably have some clinicians in the room, but we're not all clinicians. But we are all able to learn how better to support one another, our friends, our family, our colleagues, through the experiences of a diagnosis, dying and grief. That is something that we can all get better at and improve. So Compassionate Communities is a movement. It started in Australia, but it's taking deep roots right across the world, deep roots in communities, demedicalising that which doesn't need to be medical. So yes, we're always going to need specialist palliative care consultants. Yes, that always is going to need to be there when it's really required. But actually, as many people, oh yes, you've just spotted yourself, haven't you, in the photograph? Yes, sorry about that. But Felixstowe was a really good example of actually a compassionate community who this made absolute sense to automatically. They understood what was meant by creating that. And I can't stress enough how interesting this is as we see the projection of need over the next 20, 30 years. The Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, has been very clear that as our population ages, we are living longer, but clearly we're living longer with greater complexity of health. We can't medicalise everything, and nor should we want to. So this requires a public health approach to supporting one another. So with compassionate communities, it's taken many forms. I have to say, Brit and Piers Arts were amazing last year. They adopted compassionate communities as a theme for their year. They had creative health workshops, music to die for workshops. They commissioned work that explored grief and the experiences of during the pandemic. Suffolk Libraries installed bereavement bookcases, which now are their most popular collections of books. We've had things in schools. We've had an extraordinary connection with people who realised that it was, again, that reciprocal, rewarding relationship with what they were also trying to achieve. So it's been really very special. The walk-on groups, again, was something during the pandemic when we had volunteers who recognised that we couldn't bring people together for the bereavement groups that we normally would, and yet we could go walking, we could go outside. So the walk-on groups, for those who are bereaved, have been enormously successful. They're volunteer-led, they go to beautiful places. There's always coffee and cake involved. There is always a cafe at some point in the walk. And there are now regularly 80, 90 people who at one stage or other in the month will go on a bereavement walk. Now, the local NHS medical director came to us at the hospice, and I was showing him the service, and we met the volunteer who was on reception, and it was him and his wife who started the walk-on group. And I introduced the medical director and said, "Oh, this is Dennis and Sarah. They created that." And he was blown away, and he said, "Well, why do I not know about this?" And I said, "Because you don't need to know about this. It's not a commissioned NHS service. This is a compassionate community responding to a need. Generosity of time, generosity of creative thinking, really special." So philanthropy in action, for me, a wonderful example has been compassionate communities, and that has led to generosity of funding. Now, some of that has been trusts and foundations. We've actually got some National Lottery funding to support that. But in the very early days, someone said, if compassionate communities gets expensive, you're doing it wrong. So some of you will have heard of Cormac Russell, this idea of asset-based community development. You start with what's strong, not what's wrong. There's so many interesting things here to talk to a supporter about, that you see how far we've come along from those inpatient beds at the beginning. Well, there could well be supporters, people who we've taken on that journey. I've tried to squash it into half an hour, but you take people on that journey and hopefully they will really respond and become a great advocate for you. It's a lived example. So I want to say thank you. I know many of you have been involved in your local hospices. It's been 35 years of building a community hospice. It's faith in action, it's a life of public service, and it's a life dedicated to connecting our communities. And I think for that reason, there's an enormous lot of synergy between church life and a modern hospice movement. So I think there's lots to inspire us about building riches together. So our final thoughts are just a few little things. I thought, what would I want to get? And I wanted to have a picture up there of Muriel and June, who I'll talk to at the end. But civil society can be transformed by thoughtful giving and generosity in all its forms. I really believe that. Maybe it's my Salvation Army roots, but that's something in the core of our DNA that we believe in. Don't make assumptions about the wealth in your community. I think you'd be surprised where generosity can be found and where it can come from. do start with what's strong and not what's wrong. And I would really encourage you to look at very much your local community and really where the strengths are there, because I guarantee it'll be quite different to the parish down the road or up just 10 miles away. And that generosity of thought and creativity is invaluable. And it can lead to financial gifts. I know that takes time, and we can't all do it in a month, like St Mary Le Tower, but there are some seeds here. Now, Muriel and June, I'm going to finish with them. It was my enormous honour 2 weeks ago to go up to Euston with the Lord Lieutenant, and she gave Muriel and June their British Empire Medal. They've been volunteering for the hospice for 40 years. And if you've been paying attention, you know the hospice has only been going for 35 years. So if you're really paying attention, you'll click that they were fundraising before the hospice was even built. And they've only just stopped volunteering at the Framlingham shop. They're legends in Framlingham. They're great fun, they really are. But what's really interesting is that they were pioneers. They were pioneers in those early days. They recognised what was needed, but if you imagine, they had to explain to people what a hospice even was. There wasn't one, so they had to explain and give examples from where else in the country those early modern hospices had taken root. So Muriel and June were pioneers. And when I was up at Euston with them, I said, what do you say to people when you encourage them to get involved? What do you share with them? And she said, they both said almost simultaneously, we've just had so much fun. We've just had so much fun. And I think it's something about, this is not about guilt or duty or some kind of insurance policy. This is about living an enriched life and connected to your community and building what a civil society looks like together. So I really wanted to give the final word to Muriel and June. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time.